During my freshman and sophomore years of college, I was extremely awkward. I had just recently come out as gay, so I didn't have many friends. Generally, I was just kind of a big wad of social anxiety. Given that I didn't even have the social skills to try and make new friends, it was not surprising that I also had literally zero dating experience. Miraculously though, over the course of the summer after sophomore year, I sorta just grew out of the worst of my awkwardness. I lost a lot of weight and got some more confidence in myself, and my self-esteem was much higher. I came back to school in August, and by October I had made a decent number of genuine friends and gotten a lot more involved in things on campus. With all of this newfound confidence, I decided I'd finally download Grindr and see what it was like. For anyone who doesn't know, Grindr is a gay dating app that's primarily used for finding sex and hookups. Despite my recent improvement in the social arena, I was still extremely naive and inexperienced when it came to dating and sex. I set up my Grindr profile with a nice picture of myself and a very brief bio. I got a lot of messages very quickly after that picture got approved. One guy who messaged me had a display name of Dad for Young, which should have been my first red flag. Still though, at that time I was fairly oblivious. I should note that I look pretty young for my age. At the time I was 21 years old, but I would regularly be stopped by campus staff and asked which middle school or high school I was visiting from. I'm 23 now, and they still sometimes ask me if I want the younger menu if I go to a restaurant with my parents. It's that bad. So this Dad for Young sends me a message that just says, "What's up?" I replied without looking at his profile first. I then decided to take a peek and noticed he was around 54, it said. The only other text on his profile said the younger the better. His only picture was a zoomed-in blurry pic of a hairy chest, so I was very much not interested. Given my inexperience though, I thought just ignoring would be horribly rude, so I kept on responding. I don't really remember what we even talked about in the maybe 10 or so messages we exchanged, but I do remember him saying I was very cute. I know I told him I was a student, but I don't think he asked which college I went to. It's important to note that I went to a major city college, and there were a bunch of different ones all within 5 miles of each other, even more smaller ones within 10 miles of those. So, sort of like Tinder, Grindr works based off of your location, but much more precisely. If you're less than a mile or two away from someone who's online, it will display the distance in exact feet. I noticed that Dad for Young's profile said he was 25 miles away, which I thought was fairly far. He started to get more sexual in his chats and asked if I wanted to meet up. I felt a little bit bad denying him since he had been so polite, so I kinda brushed him off with saying I didn't want to meet that day, but we could keep talking a bit if he so wanted. I figured that would be that and I'd probably never talk to him again. When I checked 20 minutes later, it said he was offline now, but 30 minutes after that, I got another message from him. "Hey, my name. I thought I'd take a nice drive out to my college," with a smiley face at the end. I had not told him which college I went to. I hadn't even told him what part of town I lived in. I looked at his profile, only to see it said he was now 3 miles away. I started to freak out a bit. I didn't reply in hopes he'd just leave me alone from then on. It's important to note that my college had a couple of different campus chunks separated by a few miles. I lived on the upperclassmen residential campus, which was about 2 miles away from the main area, where all the other dorms and main buildings were. I felt like if he was going to try to find me, he'd obviously go to the main part first. Then, hopefully, he'd give up, since not many outside people even knew about this separate residential campus. 5 or 6 minutes later, I got another message. "It's no fun if you don't play along, you know. What building on residential campus name are you in?" His profile now said he was only 2,500 feet away, and every time I reopened, The distance would decrease even further. Now I was fully losing my shit at this point. This guy had the ability to pinpoint my location. I shut my blinds, turned off my light, and locked my window. I locked the door to my apartment and my bedroom door as well. My roommate at the time was out of town on some kind of retreat, so that meant it was just me. He kept on sending me messages every minute or so, saying things like, "I'm gonna find you, here I come," and other supremely creepy shit like that. The distance was down to 310 feet now. I was completely losing my mind. I had no idea what to do. I deleted my entire profile and the app too. Nothing else happened that night, although I was absolutely terrified he was going to find my door and knock on it. And fast forward to 3 days later, I decided to re-download the app after doing more research and seeing that I could adjust the settings so my exact location was not visible. When I logged on the first time with that remade profile, I adjusted some of the search filters until the results were specific enough to display Dad4Young's profile, which I promptly blocked. Later that evening, though, I got a message from someone with the display name "I Will Find You" with the same gross profile pic as Dad4Young. My stomach sank immediately. He sent a flurry of messages. "You fucked up. Almost got the police called on me because of you. I couldn't find you, so I had to go to the other dorms and find someone else. Said I was outside his dorm and told me to leave, that he'd call the cops. Well, I'm coming for your sweet virgin asshole." I freaked out, blocked him again, deleted my profile, deleted Grindr. I refused to download it or any other dating apps for a year, at which point I finally worked up the courage to check again, and haven't heard from that nutjob ever since, thank God. This is definitely the scariest experience I've ever had, so here goes. At the time, I was 10 years old and lived in a small coastal town in Newfoundland that was littered with large forests. Almost every house had acres and acres of forestry behind it, which in itself was very beautiful. As I'm now 21 and live in a bustling city in Alberta, I do find myself missing this setting in my own backyard every once in a while. But it's usually accompanied by this unsettling memory I'm about to recount for all of you. By the time I was in grade 4, I was already trusted to be home by myself, as my mother went out to visit my grandmother and aunt, who lived literally just a few minutes down the road from us. I was very happy to have such a privilege. I was an only child, and my father worked in another province months at a time, so I was very lucky to have this opportunity. Usually what this meant was late-night movies and video gaming, and on the odd night exploring the forests on my own. This particular night I happened to be exploring said woods. Usually I'd never go too far in, only up to a large rock formation I like to climb and look out through the trees in all directions. The house was always inside as well, so I never really felt scared or frightened by being there. Instead, it kind of felt like my own private place I could enjoy to myself. So there I was, scaling the rocks to sit upon my usual spot, when I suddenly started hearing a sound from further into the forest, a sound that was clearly not natural. It was like a crying, a faint crying. It sounded like a child, maybe even an infant, crying relentlessly. I was more puzzled than scared, since crying was the very last thing I would ever expect to hear in this forest. I must have listened for a good few minutes, convinced my ears were playing tricks on me, but I realized soon enough that it was, in fact, somebody crying. In my mind, I imagined it must be a young girl that had somehow wandered too far into the forest or something and needed help. I considered going back to the house and calling my mother to come help, but then I worried the girl would wander further in beyond earshot. Instead, I decided to try and locate the sound myself. I made my way hastily through the trees and branches, trying to figure out the exact direction the crying was coming from. It definitely was not as easy as I'd initially thought. It was a matter of trial and error to even make sure I was going the right direction. In my haste to find this person in need, though, the one thing I never realized was how consistent this crying was. No pausing, no words of any kind, just non-stop sobbing and wailing that seemed to have no end. What I did notice, though, as I got closer to this sound, was the closer and closer I got, the more metallic it sounded to me. Eventually, I reached upon a small clearing that had only a few small trees and bushes and not really much else of note. I had never gone this far in before, so this was the very first time I'd ever seen this area. As I made my way in, it didn't take me long to find the source of the noises. There was a great tape recorder, one of the largest I had ever seen, kind of peeking out of one of the bushes. The crying was coming out of speakers. This really disturbed me. I had gone all this way expecting to find a real person, but instead I'd found whatever the hell this was. As I was about to shut it off, I heard another sound coming just outside of the clearing on the opposite end. It sounded like steady footsteps advancing in my direction. It only took seeing a tall, shadowy figure emerging from the forest to send me running. Fortunately, though, by some complete miracle, I happened to recognize my way back by identifying rocks and trees as landmarks. Looking back, this definitely saved my life. I didn't dare to look behind me. I didn't try listening to see if the person was following me. Instead, I just kept telling myself to make it home, and nothing else mattered. I had to get home. Once I saw the large rock formation, it didn't take me long to know the rest of the way without needing to survey my surroundings. I was out of the forest in record time and sprinted right into my house, locking the door and shutting all the lights off as I went to my bedroom. I didn't want this person to know where I lived, or then I would really be done for. After shutting the curtains of my window, I peeked out them discreetly as I could to see if whoever had been out there had actually managed to keep pace with me. I didn't see anyone, but I stayed at that window for a good hour, just waiting for something to emerge from the forest shadow. But nothing ever did. After that, I went straight to bed. I never did tell my mother about what happened that night, and I also never was able to go back into that forest ever again. To give you some context, this occurred roughly 14 years ago when I was 12 years old and living in East Side Australian rainforest. When I say rainforest, our house was on a 40-acre property surrounded by bush. The house itself was owned by a Swiss man named Hans. Occasionally, he would come down with his tractor and slash the long grass surrounding our house so he could access slightly more of the property in summer. It was also extremely handy because if you know anything about Australia, it's that we have tons of beasties that can very easily kill you. We lived about a 40-minute drive from the small town center. This meant that if we needed groceries, medical attention, or to contact our parents, say while we were at school, it would be a 40-minute drive before anything could be done. The house sat on the side of a large mountain, roughly 3/4 of the way up, so naturally most of the land we called home was strewn with valleys, nooks, and hideaways. We had trails we could walk, and they led to a stream and a small waterfall. It was a truly beautiful place, but considerably scary to me and my small siblings, one brother and one sister slightly younger than me. We did know our neighbors on both sides of the property, but because the location was so remote, our nearest neighbors were a 10-minute drive away. One was this lovely old lady who used to wave to us when we got off the school bus before we made our trek to our house every day. I think our parents had asked her to keep a close eye on us to be safe. The other was this middle-aged man and his family. He was a real jerk kinda, who excavated around the bottom border where our properties met together. He would continuously interrupt the stream and waterfall's clear-flowing water supply. Lots of strange and creepy shit can happen when you're living in the middle of nowhere, but one in particular involved a certain guy I never want to meet again. Being so far removed from people and the town, it was obviously very rare to ever get visitors we didn't know would be coming. When people we didn't recognize turned up, it was almost always because they were really lost and needed some help getting to where they needed to go. One day though, a man in an ute came roaring down our driveway. I remember running inside to tell my dad that someone weird had arrived yet again. He immediately walked outside to see who this unwanted guest could be. For context about my dad, he's the most hardcore looking person you will ever meet. He only has one leg after having it amputated earlier in his life after an accident on a motorcycle while he was fleeing from police. He was also in the Navy and brought up very strictly. He had grown up in a very rough part of Sydney's west, so he had some pretty shady contacts too. In short, he's really someone you don't want to fuck with. I wouldn't be surprised if he had killed someone in his life prior to having us. Anyway, my dad goes outside to see what all this commotion is about, while my mom keeps us hidden away, being very protective. Out stepped a man with a large red-furred dog. It looked like a German Shepherd cross perhaps. It snarled at my dad and cowered right away when the stranger shouted at it to shut up. Our own dog Millie was snarling at the man and going ballistic while being chained up to the house. "Hi there, my name is John." The way the man spoke was like he was a door-to-door salesman or something. A really slick, smooth kind of guy who seemed friendly on the outside but obviously wanted something else. My dad immediately responded, "So, what the fuck are you doing here then, John?" The man was taken aback, obviously not used to dealing with someone so hostile immediately. Then they talked for a while. I could hear my dad talking with a sense of confusion about whatever this man was saying. I did overhear at some point, "What the fuck are you thinking? Just call the cops." I found out later that the lovely old lady next to us had apparently died. John was on the other side of her property, went to visit and found her dead. He asked my dad if they should move the body to make it easier for the police to investigate. This is why my dad was very concerned. Anyway, later that night, the police showed up to take a statement from my dad and John, who had been hanging around our house that entire time. I even remember my dad pulling an officer aside and explaining how suspicious it was that John wanted to move the body when he first arrived. The police left without much more questions, as it looked like she had died from natural causes. John was still at our house though. I found him to just be a very unsettling person. The way he smiled, there was like a darkness in his eyes. He was unfamiliar but acting like he had known us all for 30 years. I remember it being a school night. I was trying to watch TV and he was playing songs on his guitar with my mom and dad at the table. I was very angry because he was ruining my shows, and I told my mom I wanted him to go and stop being so weird. She smiled and told me she felt the same, and I should just go up to bed. The next day, things seemed much more normal. Went to school, came home. Not seeing that familiar, friendly face of the old woman, though, stung a lot as we passed by her house. It felt strange, you know? I hope she knew her family loved her before she passed away. I was really sad on the walk home. Until about halfway down the driveway, I noticed John's car again parked in front of our house. I walked closer and was greeted by his dog. He waited outside with my dad, and I heard him call Rusty to his car while he was leaving. Apparently, he was borrowing some tools or something. He left and waved goodbye like he was someone I was going to miss. Again, that sense of overt familiarity made me feel uncomfortable. I didn't know this man. I didn't know anything about this guy. I didn't like him either. I was hoping he'd never come down our driveway again. My dad pulled me aside and asked what I thought of John. I labeled him a weirdo and told my dad I hoped he wouldn't allow him to come back. He did come back again though. For the second night in a row, when returning my dad's tools, he kinda just barged into our house and started playing guitar and annoying everyone. My dad and mom were very visibly unimpressed by the situation. Eventually, my dad told him he needed to leave, as it was time for us to go to bed. He insisted it was early and tried to make some excuses to stay. This was so weird, right? I was polite enough to know when someone didn't want me around, so why couldn't this man get the hint? Or if he did know, why did he refuse to leave so much? After ushering him out, my mom and dad had a big talk in their room, and dad told us all he didn't like John. He was going to make sure he wouldn't come over anymore, and if we saw John again, to immediately tell him. The next day was a Saturday. We were going to blow up our cheap inflatable pool and go for a swim, as it was getting pretty warm. Around 11 a.m. though, the sound of a car thundering down the driveway alerted me, and I went outside. I ran back in to tell my dad that John was back. Just like the first time, my dad goes outside. We stay inside with my mom, listening and watching through the screen door. Look, man, I don't know who you think you are, but I don't want you coming around my house anymore. You scare my kids and my wife, and I don't want you to come back. You understand? I didn't hear John's reply, but from his tone, it seemed like he was confused. My dad wasn't having it though. He told him to go or he would call the cops. This is where things truly got weird. As my dad laid a subtle threat on the man, his face completely changed to one of rage. He stood still and glared at us in the house. He stuck up his finger and sped out the driveway, shouting profanities and churning up gravel, spraying it towards our house. My dad came back and told us we probably wouldn't be seeing John anymore, and if we did, we were going to call the cops. I was relieved. This odd man made me feel so uncomfortable in my own home. The way he reacted when he left this time confirmed those feelings for me. I can't remember if this was the Sunday or the Monday after that day, but John did come back. He tried to reason with my dad and say sorry for whatever caused us to not like him. Before he could even get out of his car though, my dad said, "If you don't turn around and leave right now, I'm gonna smash your face in." He did just that. My dad then called the police to inform them of this guy. Apparently, they were going to go and talk to John or something. A few weeks went by with no sightings or happenings, and we all felt like things were finally over. This was until we found our mailbox tipped out of the ground and smashed up. I remember asking my dad what happened, but he was not about to give me any ideas. He later told me, though, he knew it must be John after the way their last conversation had ended. The next weekend, after the mailbox incident, we went to town to get groceries and a fast food dinner. When we came back home down the driveway, though, my dad immediately stopped my mom from proceeding and noticed that something was wrong. Next to the carport where we parked our car, there was a window that opened to the bathroom. My dad must have spotted this window was missing. As we drove down, he got increasingly more tense until we all noticed the window was gone. I remember being confused in the back seat, not really understanding what was going on. There was a man standing there, those familiar dark eyes peeking out from the window that led to the shower. My dad was exploding with rage. He told my mom to rush down the driveway so we could fuck this guy up. The man proceeded to escape from the window and run down the back of our property into the thick foliage. My dad, being the only one on leg, let Millie loose as she was going ballistic tied up to the house. She raced out into the darkness. She came back with nothing. My dad went out with his flashlight and couldn't find the guy either. I'm not sure if anyone slept well that night. None of our possessions had been stolen. Nothing had even been moved. We must have just caught him as he'd been arriving. The police came the next day and searched for fingerprints to no avail. My father was furious and again alerted them to John and his strange behavior. They only told us they would look into it once again. That was the last time we heard from John, at least for that year. I had almost completely forgotten about him and had the summer off to enjoy myself and get ready for high school. The school I went to was pretty large, considering where we were, but everyone seemed to know each other pretty well, including the staff. Within my first week at the school, we were introduced to all the teachers and teachers' aides. Needless to say, I was caught completely unaware when that overly familiar dark-eyed man from the previous year was reintroduced as a teacher's aide. This time though, instead of John, he was introduced as Gregory or something. I went into a little bit of a mental spin as I was trying to make sense of this. I was 100% certain this man named Greg something or other was that exact same man who'd introduced himself as John. At the moment, so many thoughts rushed into my head. What if he had killed that old lady? What if he didn't live close by? What if he wanted to move the body so he could frame my dad or something? If he lied about something as critical as his name, what else could he be lying about? What if the police never even made contact with him? I was sitting there for a good 10 minutes, trying to piece this all together, until the teacher called my name to bring me back to reality. That's when Greg noticed me. The look on his face when he saw me was one I'll never forget. I could tell immediately he recognized me. He looked shocked. His eyes were wide. He stared at me and said nothing, like I had just found out his dirty little secret. I could sense the tension in the air and could see he felt on edge. I rushed home to tell my dad what I had just discovered. He was shocked and repeatedly asked if I was sure. He went to the school the next day to tell them and discovered the man had put in for indefinite leave and never returned. In the mid-80s, my mom was a cleaner in Australia. She would do clean houses in suburban areas and would sometimes do houses in rural and wine regions as well. We happened to live near both of those. She would leave her business cards at the local shops and got most of her business this way, some through referrals and word of mouth though. One day, she got a call from a lady who sounded to be in her 60s or so, asking my mom to clean her old farmhouse. She made a lot of odd demands. My mom would usually meet with clients before taking on new business. In this case though, the lady really did not want to meet my mom and said she would leave the keys under the front doormat instead. My mom agreed mainly because the lady was quite obviously wealthy and was offering to pay a hefty sum, substantially more than she would normally expect. My mom went to the house on a Monday morning and said she felt immediately unnerved by how long the driveway was. The house was essentially in the middle of a very large, very deserted and empty property. Still though, she did find the keys under the mat and got to work cleaning right away. About an hour in, she heard the back door slam shut. Mom was told that no one would be at the house, so immediately she felt unsafe. She stood frozen in the kitchen for what she said felt like 3 to 4 minutes, although it could have been much longer. There was no other car on the property either. She wanted to leave immediately, but still had 2 rooms left to do. Both were bedrooms. As time passed though, she heard nothing else and decided that perhaps it had just been nothing. Perhaps something had fallen and it hadn't been the door after all. She walked up the hallway and stepped into the bedroom. All over the bed were these black and white photos. As my mom got closer, she began to realize that these photos were all of her. Some were taken at our family home. Many others were taken at the different houses my mom would clean. Some were through windows or even over fences. She grabbed the house phone to call the police and immediately drove to the end of the driveway. The lady who'd hired her ended up being investigated, but continued to claim it had simply been a break-in. After some time, the police stopped with their searching, and we ended up moving to a new town 4 months later. Every time my mom tells this story, I get serious chills. Absolutely a true story too. To this day, my mom thinks the lady had something to do with it. But why? And for what purpose? Any theories?